About 1450, a major global transition took place with the withdrawal of the Chinese from global interactions and trade, and Europe was on the rise in trade. Europe began exploring, trying to find new routes to the rest of the world. In 1492, Columbus accidentally found the Americas. The Byzantine Empire fell to the power of the Ottoman Turks, and by 1750 the empire was in decline. Russia emerged from Mongol control to forge an empire under the rule of the Romanovs. New patterns of world interactions formed as societies of the eastern and western hemispheres exchanged cultural traditions across the Atlantic Ocean. The volume of trade in the Indian Ocean increased, with the Europeans into waters that already saw great commercial activity among Indian, Muslim, and African peoples. The Columbian Exchange untied the eastern and western hemispheres across the Atlantic Ocean. The exchange of human beings created a new interaction between Africa and the Americas. Slave systems became a part of the Western world, and the result was the unification of three cultures: Africa, Europe, and America.
Trade was the major change from 1450 to 1750. The biggest change in trade was the opening of the Americas. World trade was not only altered in its patterns, but also in its products. The metals and crops of the Americas and the Atlantic slave trade from West Africa to the Western Hemisphere brought new wealth to the Europeans. Another change was the European dominance of Indian Ocean trade. First the Portuguese, then the Spanish, Dutch, and British replaced Arab merchants as the carriers of goods in the Indian Ocean. There were also cultural and intellectual changes. Europe had a spirit of religious reform, which created new religious denominations and promoted education. The scientific revolution provided new explanations to the nature of the universe, while Enlightenment thought analyzed the nature of political relationships. But at the same time, there were several continuities from 1450 to 1750. Continuity in the world trade included the overland routes of Asia. Since the classical period, the products of Asia, such as silk and porcelain, moved along the Silk Road that connected Asia to the Middle East. The role of women stayed the same for the most part in all areas around the world. Much of Eurasia remained the same in customs and religions, contrasting with Europe, who was facing several cultural and religious revolutions.
There were several demographic changes throughout the world. However, Europe had a lack of migration within itself because nationalism started to appear at this time. The only major migration in Europe was from rural areas to urban ones. The Spanish and Portuguese effectively expanded to the Americas, causing their people to migrate and have a stable or decreasing population. Russia took over the port of St. Petersburg to move towards Western ways and change their country's culture. There were environmental problems in England, as they traditionally used trees for fuel, and eventually they simply ran out. As this resource dwindled, coal came to replace it. There were also environmental problems when Spain and Portugal started their gold and silver mines in the Americas. The population of North America had a great increase as more and more people began to migrate to the Americas for religious freedom, a new lifestyle, or to make a profit. The natives of the Americas were displaced over and over again. Slave populations increased in the Caribbean due to the formation of the economy around plantations. The Mughal Empire in India expanded and grew in population, which caused the focus of the culture and religion to grow, along with the successes of the government. European presence grew larger as the interest in the strategic points of India expanded. Merchants and other influences came for different reasons, such as trade and colonization, increased the presence of Islam in Southeast Asia.
In Europe, the social class structures began to change due to economic changes. Now, families were concentrated on the immediate family, and marriages were not arranged as often. Also, marriage was put off until later, and divorce rates climbed. Joint stock companies led to a major weakening in the aristocracy because they allowed lower classes to financially rise above the upper class. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate required that daimyos live in the capital every other year so that there was not enough time to build power bases in the area they controlled, which prevented Europeans from exploiting tensions by providing aid to daimyos. In China, eunuchs and mandarins were used to keep aristocrats from rebelling against the bureaucracy. Eunuchs were used as alternative to bureaucrats who could form local loyalties to aristocrats through intermarriage. Mandarins were used to make sure bureaucrats were loyal to the emperor. In Russia, Ivan IV centralized rule under the kingship by having the boyars killed. Spanish men did not bring their wives to the New World, so they interbred with native women. This caused a new social structure in colonies based on race and place of birth. In all areas, women were still suppressed.
There were several revolutions and changes in Europe at this time. There was a religious reform in the Catholic Church in reaction to the Catholic Church's use of indulgences. Martin Luther and John Calvin both broke away from the Catholic Church and created the Protestant Church and Calvinism, respectively. Henry VIII broke away from the Church and created the Anglican Church so that he could divorce his wife. The Enlightenment was a time when philosophy took center stage in Europe. Reason was the primary source of legitimacy for authority. During the scientific revolution, modern science began to take the lead. There was a big change in how people went about solving problems. Instead of already having an answer and then proving it, people started to conduct experiments to find their answers. The interactions between Europe, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere were all relative to trade and colonization. In 1453, the Hundred Years' War came to an end and the Ottoman Empire took over Constantinople. In 1440, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. In 1450, Europe was about to enter the Renaissance. This was also the first time that the entire globe was encompassed in a global network of trade. Maritime trade rose in proportion to land-based trade with the establishment of the Atlantic trade system. The power and influence of nomadic people declined and labor systems were transformed to the introduction of the slave trade. In the absence of the Mongols, Russia and China began to rebuild their empire.
In Europe, there was constitutionalism and absolutism. Constitutionalism is a system under which the law is above the king. Under absolutism, the king is the absolute ruler. Parliament had already established constitutionalism in England. In the Ottoman Empire, their success came from the creation of an army, establishment of business, and cleverness of the leader. Janissaries, Christian slaves used as soldiers, also played a major role. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate created a bureaucracy. In the Americas, the Spanish crown wanted to establish royal authority over existing settlements and natives in Spanish America, so they created the Council of Indies. The Atlantic Ocean trade eventually led to the crossing of the Pacific Ocean. New maritime technologies made these interactions possible, and global trade patterns changed dramatically. Major maritime powers at this time included Portugal, Spain, France, and England, and major gunpowder empires were the Ottoman, Ming and Qing China, the Mughal, Russia, Tokugawa, Songhai, and Benin. This was the big era for slave systems and slave trade, with the new European colonies in the Americas relying on slavery very heavily. The slave trade was an important link in the Atlantic Ocean trade. The new trade patterns greatly altered habitats for plants and animals and resulted in changes in human diet and activities as well. Major migrations across the Atlantic Ocean also altered demographic patterns profoundly. This era was also shaped by the European Renaissance, Protestant Reformation, and Enlightenment. Neo-Confucianism grew in influence in China, and a new art forms developed in the Mughal Empire in India. For the first time, the Western Hemisphere came into continued contact with the Eastern Hemisphere. Technological innovation strengthened political organization and economic prosperity all contributed to this change that completely altered world trade patterns. Technological advances and willingness of political leaders to invest in it meant that sea-based trade became much more important. As a result, old land-based empires lost relative power to the new sea-based powers. The relative power and prosperity of Europe increased dramatically during this time in comparison to empires in the longer established civilization areas. However, Europe did not entirely eclipse powerful empires in Southwest Asia, Africa, and East Asia. Empires in older civilization areas gained new strength from new technologies in weaponry. Basing their new power on gunpowder, they still suffered from the old issues that had plagued land-based empires for centuries: defensive borders, communication within the empire, and maintenance of an army adequate to defend the large territory. By the end of the era, many were less powerful than the new sea-based kingdoms of Europe.